I got this opportunity to make some corner shelves for some good friends of ours. We settled on this zigzag design to hold some display items, plants, kids' toys. This was the last project that overlapped my shop burning down. If you don't know that story, search my channel for that video. As a result, there was a pretty long timeline to get this project finished. Special thanks to our friends for being so patient. Let's get to the build. I got a beautiful 12-inch by 10-foot cherry board. I started by cross-cutting it to more manageable lengths at the miter saw. After that, I ripped each board, which would match the exact depth of the shelves, plus 1/8 of an inch. If there's any dings and scratches that I get along the way, I can easily shave off up to that 1/8 of an inch, effectively giving me a buffer, so while I'm working on the piece, I don't have to be super delicate with it. Once the strips have been cut out, I rotate them to try to match the grain as best as I can. In a couple of spots, I didn't have enough material to make continuous boards, so I'll have to laminate a couple of pieces. I used to use dowels to align boards like this for a glue-up, but I found with a couple of well-placed clamps and a caul, I don't have any problems with alignment. And I'm going to be planing these boards later anyway, so any slight deviations in thickness will be taken care of later. Once the glue-up is done, I trim down the pieces further to the exact width and smooth them out over at the jointer. Next, I work on the joinery that will connect the sides. I'm using what's called a locking rabbet joint. I start by cutting out a rabbet on the table saw, making multiple passes to clear out the waste. Once I have the rabbet established, I cut the rabbet on all of the horizontal pieces, being sure to label them as I go, so I don't get confused which is which and which side faces forward. Once the rabbets were cut out, I line the pieces up and mark some layout lines for the mating piece. These will be the vertical connector pieces. I set a marking gauge to the depth of the rabbet and then mark that on the mating piece. Then it's just a matter of clearing out the waste at the table saw. If you want a full tutorial on how I actually do this joint, you can see that video in my shorts. Now thankfully, most of these joints came together just fine, but I did have a little bit of play in some of them. And you'll see later how I fixed that during the glue up. Next, I need to cut the 45-degree angle connecting joint so that the left and the right side of the shelf can meet in a clean 90-degree angle. While I'm at it, I use a jack plane to clean up some of the burn marks left by the table saw. Cherry burns really easily, so this is pretty routine by now. During the glue up, I use a framing square to establish a 90-degree reference. For any joint that has a little bit of a gap, I add some wood glue and rub some cherry shavings into the joint. This always works well to close up tiny little gaps that otherwise might stick out. Once the glue up is dry, I take a plane over the joint just to smooth things over and make sure everything is completely flat. It's amazing what a difference just this simple step makes to create a clean joint. Now, I mentioned some of the locking rabbets were a little loose. Now to fix that, I simply added a bead of glue into the rabbet and then took some shavings and lay them out, doubling up where necessary. This is just enough to add the few thousandth of an inch to close up that gap. Using the actual material like this means that the color will be a perfect match, and you're using the actual wood fibers to add structure to the joint while filling the gap. Here I'm using 90-degree clamps that were 3D printed to hold the corners tight. After the glue is dry, I use a chisel to clean out the glue squeeze out as well as the excess shavings. Now on the left-hand side of the piece, I follow the same process, marking out the 45-degree corners. I strike a line using a long combination square to make sure that each 45-degree angle ends at the exact same length. I use the saw kerf on a sacrificial fence to line up the piece perfectly and make the cut. For the two right pieces, I clamp them together to make sure that the measurements match exactly. Taking those pieces back to the table saw, I make the cuts. Now's a good time to do a little bit of sanding. And for these vertical pieces, I really wanted them to shine, so I used a hand plane to get an extra glossy smooth finish. I try to use a hand plane whenever I can because you simply can't beat the smooth, glassy feeling, especially on cherry, which planes so nicely. Lining up each 45-degree corner, I use a combination square to mark for some dowels. I've been using this GSM doweling jig, and it works really well for moments like this. To reinforce these 45-degree miters, it will also help with the glue up, as you'll see. Now I'm drilling for 3/8-inch dowels. However, the dowels that I have are just slightly too big, so I use a hand plane to shave them down until they fit just right. I'm using Titebond 3 here just to give myself a little bit more open time to make sure everything goes together perfectly. Now here I am using my shaving trick to close a slight gap that's in the back of this miter. This trick works so well. In complicated builds like this, where there's a lot of opportunities for error, it really helps. And after a little bit of shimmying, the miters come together. Now at this stage, the shelf is a little fragile, so I decided to add some temporary support brackets to the back while working on it. I used a block plane to create chamfers on all the long edges. Then I used a chisel to continue the chamfer into the corners of the miters. This is a little finicky, but it works great. Now because time was running out, I decided to use a chamfer bit in my trim router to speed up the process, still using a chisel to complete the chamfers in each corner. I used a combination of a card scraper and a chisel to clean up the inside corners of the miters. At this stage, I felt the piece needed a little something extra, so I decided to continue the chamfers into the locked rabbet joints. I was a little nervous to do this at first because it's a big decision to cut straight into the face of a piece like this. But after doing some tests, I realized this is exactly the little detail that a shelf like this needed. Now to hang the shelf on the wall, I'm going to use a series of cleats, which I cut out from scraps of cherry. One of the cleats I trimmed at the table saw at 45 degrees, so it essentially creates a mounting point that is a French cleat. So as I'm working on the shelf, I can hang it on the wall and hold it there while I continue working on the other cleats. Now because this is long grain to long grain, I'm not using any fasteners, it's just glue. I added 2 dabs of super glue to either side to create a permanent bond and to avoid the need for clamps, which on a 45-degree angle would have been impossible anyway. Now when it came time to finish, I decided to try something new and use shellac. It's a finish I've been curious about for a long time now. I bought a can of spray shellac and I was immediately blown away by the results. It instantly started to transform the cherry and pop the grain. The spray shellac ended up being a little bit finicky to work with because it's much more prone to drips and runs on vertical surfaces, which this piece has a lot of. I did my best to rotate the piece so I could equalize what was horizontal and what was vertical, but the nature of the spray made it very difficult to avoid this problem. So when I continued the next day, I decided to go one step further and mix my own shellac so I could apply it using this ball of rags called a rubber. This actually solved all of my problems. It went on beautifully smooth and created an even better finish than the spray. I loved mixing my own because I could control the strength of the mixture. This meant that each layer didn't go on too thick and gave really predictable results. It also has proven to be very easy to repair. A card scraper was enough to remove any problem areas, so I could simply go over the area again with more shellac. Now I was upstate for a few days, so I took the project with me to finish it with a few more coats of shellac and some paste wax. At the end of the day, I'm super proud of this piece. There was a lot to figure out. I had never done locking rabbets or mitered joints before, but I think we ended up with a really beautiful piece that really adds some life to what was otherwise just an empty corner. Thank you guys so much for having a look. Remember to like and subscribe when you get a chance, and I will see you on the next one.